Alright, so welcome to the second video of the first chapter of sociology, which is the various perspectives that we are. Okay, so welcome to the second video of the first topic that we are discussing in sociology, which is related to the sociological perspectives. And in the last video we discussed positivism, and we also touched upon interpretivism and interactionism, which we will of course do in detail in another video. But because we were discussing modernity, and because in modernity what happens is that everything has a perfectly rational explanation, we will now discuss postmodernism. Alright, postmodernism. So postmodernism follows the modernist theories. Okay, so when you hear the word postmodernism, there are certain things that must come to your mind. I will discuss this in a little bit more detail, but first, certain things must immediately click in your mind. What are the words that should come to your mind when you hear postmodernism? Number one, the first word that comes to your mind is meta-narratives. Okay, so that is the first thing, meta-narratives. The second thing that should come to your mind is theoretical criticisms. Okay, this theory criticizes, postmodernist theory criticizes other theories. So criticism should come into your mind. The third thing that should come into your mind is versions of truth. Okay, versions of truth. This theory is not about creating or revealing the truth. The positivists were concerned with revealing the truth. The interpretivists were concerned with creating knowledge. Here they are talking about versions of truth. And when you're talking about versions of truth, there's another thing that should come to your mind when you're talking about postmodernist theories, which is subjectivity. Alright, so these are the four things that should immediately crop up when you are talking about postmodernism, right? So there are various versions of the truth, and there are criticisms involved here, and there are meta-narratives involved here. So we will now see what this means. So what exactly is postmodernism? Let's look at it in a little bit of detail. First and foremost, postmodernism criticizes positivism. Alright, why does it criticize positivism? Why does it criticize the modernist concepts? Alright, because it fundamentally rejects that you can understand the social world based on either empirical tests or rational knowledge, reaching rational conclusions about society. They reject both. Okay, so the positivists were mainly concerned about empirical proof about something. So they were more concerned with finding about quantitative data and stuff like that. But keep in mind, the postmodernists don't just reject the positivist point of view, they also criticize the interpretivist point of view. So they are not embracing interpretivism. They are rejecting, in a sense, they are rejecting both. They are criticizing both. And why are they criticizing? Because they are also rejecting the rational methods of reaching. So then what happens when they reject both? When they reject both viewpoints, then something else emerges, and there's that other thing that emerges is the narratives. And some stories, as I said, these narratives are stories, and sometimes there are some stories that become dominant in a particular society. So So those stories acquire leadership in those societies. For example, think about the partition of the subcontinent. The Indians will have one story to tell you. In their country, certain stories take the leadership and they are subscribed to by society generally. They are not going to listen to our stories. They will have their own stories to tell, and we have our own stories to tell about partition. So over there, those stories which they tell from their point of view, they acquire leadership. This leadership of narrative, the meta narrative, then becomes the predominant story in that society, and when something establishes its leadership, we call it hegemony. So these meta narratives establish their hegemony in those societies, their leadership in those societies. They become the predominant narratives of the time or of that space where they dominate. All right. So these narratives then become your version of the truth. It is not necessary for every story to be factually correct. But when a story is subscribed to by, let's say, 1 million people or 10 million people or 100 million people, then those stories become like the truth and they become the version of the truth. So they have their version of the truth about the partition. We have our version of the truth about the partition. And what are these truths based on? They are ultimately based on subjective understanding of what was going on at the time. Okay, what does subjective mean? Subject to our opinions, subject to our biases. So one nation will look at, for example, the Japanese will look at the Second World War from their angle, and they will have certain notions and certain biases about it, and they will tell their story. And the British will look at the Second World War from their angle. They will have certain biases and certain meta narrative in their country about the Second World War, and they will tell the story subjectively based on their biases and their opinions and their understanding of history. For example, the British will always say that the rise of Hitler in Germany happened because of the Great Depression. Now that is their version of the truth. It happened because of economic hardship in Germany. Whereas if you go and ask someone who's a Nazi sympathizer, he is going to tell a completely different story. He is going to say, no, this never happened because of the depression. The rise of Hitler happened because of the way Germany was mistreated after the First World War. So these are two very different stories that dominate. Of course, the meta narrative now even in Germany is that it happened because of the Great Depression. So now this is the predominant theory, that the rise of Hitler happened only because of economic reasons and not because of any political repression of Germany that took place. This is the meta narrative in Europe now. It is the story that has established hegemony in the world. So when so the postmodernists will say, look, there is no such thing as objective testing, you know, that the positivist was talking about. Check everything objectively. All right, there is no such thing as objective testing. Why? Because there are always certain criteria that we establish against which we test the truth. Okay, for example, in an atheistic society, everything will be judged against criteria established by science, not by religion. So over there, objective testing is based on criteria set by science, which again is something very subjective. We have decided to use science as the basis, and in a country where religion dominates, there everything is determined against criteria set by science. So this brings the postmodernists to a criticism of scientific knowledge. They say scientific knowledge does not necessarily represent progress. It does not do that. Why? Because even science is not dispassionately objective. It is not a dispassionate search for the truth. For example, again, if you take the example of Einstein, in Germany, when Einstein was coming up with his theories, at that time his theories did not conform with the meta-narratives that were accepted in the scientific world in Germany. So, but later on, his scientific theories were accepted, and then they became the meta-narrative. So, what is the search for the truth? Is it always dispassionately objective? The postmodernist will say no. So, science then also conforms to community. So this is a question, and this was brought up by Prelli, Prelli, in 1989. He came up with this idea that even science is not a completely objective search for the truth. It also conforms to certain requirements in the community. All right. So this is what the postmodernists have to say. They are talking about meta narratives. They say people are subjective. They also come up with theoretical and practical criticism. So this was one thing that I mentioned earlier. They criticize both positivists and the interpretivists. Okay. So they are saying, yes, you are doing research, you are observing things, but even those observations are dependent on the theories that you have in mind. Okay, you observe grass. All right, this is grass, but in order to recognize grass, you should have an understanding or a theory about what grass is. You have a theory about what grass looks like. So observation is also theory dependent. So everything at the end of the day is subjective, and the objectivity that they were talking about, that the objectivists were talking about, is not exactly there. And they also criticize the interpretivists because the stories that are there, they will lead to subjective interpretation of realities in society. Okay, so read up, and I hope that you will understand postmodernism better after this. Thank you very much. I'm now going to, in the next video, I'm now going to talk about interpretivism in a little bit of detail. Thank you very much.